Thank you, Joe, and good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Is this good? I can't hear me, but that's good. Okay, so Joe asked me to come and speak today about something and asked me to give him a title. And I didn't know what I should talk about. So I said, how about cognitive mechanisms of whatever your talk will be on? And so hence the title. And so desirable difficulty, I thought would be a useful thing for us to think about. I suspect you talked a bunch about it yesterday at the workshops. Danny mentioned it a little bit before. The talks after me are going to talk about this. And when we think about desirable difficulty, this has become a very big deal in the last 20 years. The other thing I want to say is this is me giving the talk today with work from a bunch of other collaborators. Melissa Patak, who's a grad student in our lab, Sandra Thompson, who's faculty at St. Thomas out in New Brunswick now, and Karen Humphreys, with whom I collaborate on a number of other projects. And I'm married too, but yeah, anyway. So what counts as desirable difficulty? This has become a topic that people have latched onto. It's an idea that is comfortable for us. It makes sense for us. It's a little bit counterintuitive. It sticks in our minds. We like the idea. What I'm going to try and talk to you about today is this idea that it's a real set of things that happen, and it's a real set of things that we don't understand very well. And sometimes it works, and sometimes we think we're doing the right thing, but we're actually doing the opposite thing. And that would be fine if we could tell the difference. I don't think we can tell the difference very much. The best we do is we do some things, we do some other things, and some work and some don't, and we label the ones that work as desirable. And that's fine, but that's not science. And McMaster pays me to come and do science, and so that's what I would like to talk to you about today. But yeah, what counts as desirable difficulty? Can we reason, theorize? I'm going to say, can we just guess about the mechanisms that might be involved? Can we think about, with all of these good ideas and good data we have about issues in desirable difficulty, is there other knowledge that we have that we could in fact use to constrain what is plausible in those other ideas? And yeah, can we come up with a more general mechanistic account of what this desirable difficulty thing should be, and what does that mean for us? Okay, so we should start this where most of these talks start, with this guy, right? This is Bob Bjork, if you don't recognize him. I didn't have a psychedelic picture of Elizabeth Bjork to put up next to it, but she's involved as well, right? And 20-some years ago, Bob and Elizabeth Bjork published this idea, this new theory of disuse, which was a somewhat different memory account of how we learn things and how we forget things. And so in the history of psychology, learning is where it's at, right? That is what we think about in psychology. We think about attention, we think about all of these other things, but ultimately memory is the central point where everything has to pass through. And hundreds of years ago, this is what psychology and before that natural philosophy was. It's about memory. It's about how we know things, how we remember things. And this idea from Bjork and Bjork is important because it actually adds a whole new way of thinking about things from very famous people, Hull and Estes, people who defined what psychology was for 50 or 100 years. This is a very new way to think about these things. And it's been very influential. And so this idea was that memory strength doesn't just get enhanced as you have more experiences with things. The idea of desirable difficulty is the amount of work you do for a particular encoding episode. The more you work on it, the harder it is for you to do that. That might give you a more valuable experience at the time. And so the apparent paradox is, if I give you a whole bunch of experiences of the same thing, the second and subsequent ones of those are maybe very bad learning experiences because you don't have to do a lot of work to understand them, right? So I give you this new idea once, you think about it deeply, you think about it, you work on it, you encode it, then I give you the same thing again, and you don't do all of that dredging up and figuring out because it's already fresh in your mind, right? And so it's not that the first one was so hard, we could even think of the first one was typical. It's that the second one was so useless, right? That second experience went in your eyeballs but didn't really go into memory very strongly, because it's already activated in mind. Anyway, this is the idea about this distinction between how well you might know a thing and how effective new encoding episodes might be relative to how accessible that stuff is. And this has spawned a whole bunch of research on a lot of things that we are all, again, probably going to talk about today. The spacing effect, the testing effect, mixed presentation, all of these ideas of how practically in a classroom you might try and take advantage of these things, right? How can we get people to remember our material better? Well, you can do a bunch of these things. Make people space out their study. Make people test themselves rather than just read again. It's nothing magical about testing other than it's a really nice way for an external environment to organize you, point you in the right direction, put a thing in front of you, make it high stakes, motivate you, and say, quick, here, learn this, right? Anyway, this is the background of sort of why we're all here, why we think cognition might be important for education. And there are other people as well, but we're going to talk about Bob Bjork today. So when we get to desirable difficulty, this is one of many possible vague definitions of what we're talking about. To make a task optimally useful for learning, right? We put you in this optimal zone of difficulty that gets you to do a lot of processing for that task, but that you can still manage to do, and it results in some high quality encoding experience. We've made something desirably difficult, this Goldilocks zone in the middle, that if we made it too easy, you wouldn't really pay attention very much. If we made it too hard, you didn't understand it, right? So we want to make it difficult, but we want to make it desirably difficult. It's desirable because it leads to better encoding and gives you better later memory. Okay. I feel I'm just telling the background here. Is everyone on board? Okay. So here's my question. Is this a mechanism? Is this a thing that your brain does? Or is it a label? And I am going to apparently go on video record today to say it is the latter most of the time, or a large minority of the time at least, right? This idea of desirable difficulty is deceptively powerful for us as an explanatory tool. But I would argue as a cognitive scientist that it isn't a good mechanism, right? It isn't a good description of an actual process or mechanism in our brain that's doing a particular thing, right? And so more often than we would like, I won't say most of the time, but I would say way more often than we should be happy with, calling something a desirable difficulty is what we do after we did some random thing and it happened to work, right? We are collecting stamps about these things, right? We're going out in the world, seeing we're being guided by a very clever theory and best intentions, but ultimately we're seeing what works and what doesn't, and the things that work we call desirable. The things that don't work traditionally are technically known as POD, plain old difficulty, right? And I think Aristotle or Plato or Thales or someone before that maybe has published that. Doing hard stuff is hard. Doing hard stuff is distracting. We have hundreds of years of publications saying, when I make things hard, you remember them less well. That's why this desirable difficulty thing has legs, right? This paper that got published in 1992 has generated its own substantial subfield in the memory literature, that this is desirable difficulty, and it's weird and interesting and different because we make things hard, and yet it's magically helpful to us. So, what is the mechanism underlying that magical helpfulness is the question. Yes, this is not satisfying. So, in fact, in Bob Bjork's Festschrift volume from 2011, there's a chapter that actually Amy Pichai alerted me to about 3 days ago, which gave me at least 1.5 days to get it express from Amazon and read that whole chapter. And McDaniel and Butler here essentially make the same point. Desirable difficulty isn't a working parts theory. I mean, the new theory of disuse from Bjork definitely is. But this idea of what makes things desirable is not necessarily a good predictive theory. And they suggest some things that might actually underlie what makes things desirable. And they essentially talk about relations between encoding and retrieval. Very, very well-developed, well-studied, well-demonstrated memory factors, right? So the idea of context match from study to test, transfer appropriate processing. Essentially, their argument is desirable difficulties come about when the difficulty manipulation at study is a task that happens to direct you towards considering or working on the kind of relationships or the particular bits of information that happen to be the thing you're going to test me on later, right? So if I'm doing some word generation task or some relational task that's making me pay attention to particular word associates or something, when I test you on that information, that kind of thing is desirably difficult. And they suggest this context matching thing as a starting point. So that's a good thing, that people are thinking about these issues. Somewhat more recently, let's say in the last 5 years or so, this desirable difficulty thing has spread substantially beyond this pure memory literature. And people have started to look at a whole bunch of effects in terms of executive control and selective attention, things where you're not setting up particular kinds of tasks, so there's no apparent match between the particular information you learned and the way you're testing it. And nevertheless, we make a task difficult, and you learn that stuff better, well beyond this sort of general principles of memory idea, right? And so there are lots of these examples, and I'm sure you've heard of them, and a bunch of them have come out of Bob Bjork's lab. So things like giving you information in the midst of other distracting information, and you have to sort of selectively find the stuff you're looking for and then process that. So fending off distracting information seems to make your performance, your later memory performance better. If I make the text fuzzy, do you have to work harder to figure out what it is, and will you remember that better? If I put my lecture notes up in some weird font, I think there's a study showing that you remember those things better. So are you disrupting people's fluency? Are you making them work harder? Can I trick your attention, your selective attentional system, to pay attention to what I think is important, independent of you wanting to pay attention? I flash little things on the screen that makes you look over here, and then I put a word up there. All of these things, and many, many, many more, are starting to be shown to make a difference. And people are framing this as not in a theory of disuse kind of idea, but they're framing it in very much this idea that I made you do a difficult thing that normally would be distracting and normally would make you worse, but it actually makes your memory better. And so we sort of come to this sort of attentional cognitive control version. And I want to show you my favorite of all of these many studies, which is actually from this lab right here, and a few authors are probably sitting in the audience. This is Tamara Rosner, Maria D'Angelo, Ellen McClellan, wherever she is, very good, and Bruce Milliken, done here at McMaster a year or two ago, and this research is ongoing. And I love this experiment, it's wonderful. So I show you these kind of displays. 2 words, one in red, one in green, for people who are not red-green colorblind. And yeah, those results are much better. And I interleave these words, as you can see. I don't have to demonstrate, I have a picture, right? And sometimes you get 2 of the same word, and sometimes you get 2 different words, and the task, and you just get one of these at a time. And your task is, say the red word out loud, quickly as you can. Really easy, read the red word off the screen. And so what do you expect happens in this kind of experiment? Well, you're a lot better at doing this one, right? You're quicker and make fewer mistakes when we give you this version. But it turns out you have better memory for the red words when we make you do this interleaved version, right? And if you go 20 years ago and ask a memory person, I'm going to show you a word twice versus once. And even for the ones I show you once, I'm going to put all this other distraction in the middle. Which one do you predict you should remember better 20 minutes later, right? Everyone and their dog says this one will be remembered better, right? And it's only not surprising to us because we've done a few of these experiments now, and clearly this is the best one to pick now because it's obvious that all of that selective attention, all of this effortful having to fend off the meaning of this other word to get this, or not necessarily the meaning, but to fend off this green distractor word to focus on the red word gives you better encoding of that red word. So we could even say in this case you are the amount of executive control, the amount of, what's the word I'm looking for? The amount of resistance to interference, the amount of conflict resolution you're doing. All of this stuff is benefiting memory encoding. Whereas here you just kind of read the word, nothing interferes. Okay, so if we think about the Bjork stuff and we think about all of these attentional kind of things, where should we go from there? One way to read some of that Bjork work is to say, working harder at encoding means getting better memory, right? If you work less hard at encoding, is my slide backwards? No, it's good. So if you work hard, you get better memory. And when you work less hard, you don't have to work as hard when that stuff is fresh in your mind. And we get the stuff from Rosner et al. Saying that attentional work makes us remember things better. We get to this general next step of saying, all right, well, cognitive control is really what we're needing to do. And so by cognitive control, in psychology, we pretend we know what that thing means, right? But it's something close to deliberate, volitional, paying attention, selective effort that's hard to do, that's exhausting. It's your subjective mind taking control and dealing with that stuff. So if we require more work, more cognitive control, more sort of selective grappling with a task, should we predict better memory for those things? And so this is what I want to talk about today, but I want us to make some predictions here first. So let's look at a couple of examples, right? So imagine this task. I'm going to show you a name, and it will be a name that you're familiar with from your culture, right? So we are using typical Western, mostly Anglo names that the undergraduate students we're testing know about, right? Typical male and female names. And we're asking you to just tell us, is this male or female? We're not trying to trick you. Kate, female. Bruce, male. We don't have any Alexes. We don't have any things where you have to decide. This is really easy to do. No one makes mistakes. It's super straightforward. But we're going to give you some distracting information, right? Rather than interleaving those words, we're going to give you a hint about the answer and a hint about the wrong answer. And we tell you, whatever you do, don't pay attention to those words because they'll trick you half the time. Just focus on the word. But nevertheless, this will sneak in as you look at these two words on the screen. And so I think we should predict that this will definitely be worse when you perform the task. And so is the extra work you have to do fending off that extra information going to do the same as that other one? We should predict, yeah. We can look at another example with similar kinds of primes. If we get you to press buttons for left female, right male, or something like that, and we put up primes in terms of which button you should be pressing. All the cognitive control literature says, yeah, this is really hard to do as well. And so in these two situations, as examples, what's your sense? Is this like that thing we just saw? This is eliciting all of this cognitive control. Does this seem like a reasonable idea? Maybe. I think it generally seems like a good idea. However, you've been to enough talks that you know what's coming, right? I think these are very, very, very different situations, right? And so what I would like to talk about today is this idea that desirable difficulty isn't a general thing, that difficulty is not a task general thing, that difficulty in and of itself is a weird idea in any general sense, right? I think we really need to think about how brains work and how, or from what we know about cognitive psychology, what we should be doing here. So we know that this high-level cognitive control is needed to do a lot of things. When this to-be-remembered information is the focus of that cognitive work, we should remember it better. But making things difficult should be a much more fine-grained thing. Let me tell you what I mean about that. Okay, consider the clip art brain. What happens when we look at something like this, right? So what happens when I show you a little word on the screen? Well, you get some sensory input, and that sensory input zips down your optic nerve to this occipital cortex at the back of your head. And you don't have the word cat there, you have a bunch of little visual features and contrast. And then your occipital and related bits, do a bunch of perceptual work to figure out and rebuild that thing, to sort of rebuild this idea, and maybe even start to recognize it as a symbol. And then you have all of this extra semantic activation that goes on in your head to recognize symbolically and semantically what this thing is. And you get a bunch of featural information about this, right? This is easy. This happens in about 200 milliseconds whether you want it to or not. I just put that thing on the screen and pop, it's in your head, right? You can't stop it being in your head. It takes zero effort. I can also give you a task to do potentially. I can say, tell me if this thing is alive or not. So maybe I'll show you cat, maybe I'll show you table, right? And so now we have a task to do, which is sort of pay attention or select out a particular feature or a particular kind of information, and then do a particular thing because of it, right? And that is infinitely harder for us to do. Infinite is a strong word. It's much, much harder for us to do. And so this response selection thing involves all this prefrontal cortical network getting fired up to represent what we should be doing, what we should pay attention to. It has to bind together the right bits from all of the semantic stuff. And eventually, after what seems an age in millisecond terms, right, eventually we get to this idea that, oh yeah, there's enough information here to say that I think that the activation we have is an alive thing, not a live thing. And then eventually, once we've figured out that that goes with a certain behavior, we can set off that behavior and it's all easy again. Cognitive psychologists are bad at drawing things generally. So this takes a surprising amount of time. So when we want to do this kind of thing, we don't draw pretty brains. We do things like this, right? What happens between the stimulus and the response? So here's another example. Is 7 odd or even? So often we try and make these little time scale models that look like this, right? So we're going to do the sensation or perception thing where the length of this bar is essentially the amount of time. We're drawing a little graph for these modular stages of processing. And the point I'm trying to make here, rather than be a second-year general lecture, is we have a lot of clever ways for trying to selectively investigate the time course and the processing at very specific bits and stages. When your brain does a thing, your brain isn't this whole undifferentiated network that just decides. Brains are modular. Cognition, to an extent, is modular. And we have these specialized little processing units that do their job and pass that information on. The idea that an entire task is difficult, well, it feels difficult, but the difficulty isn't general. The difficulty is processing an information specific, right? If we are getting up in front of our class and saying, I wonder what will be desirable. I know 70 decibels of white noise will really make people work hard to hear me, and all of that effort will help. I mean, we laugh at that and say, well, yeah, of course that's dumb. Of course that wouldn't help. Does surrounding things with distracting information sound like a good idea? Nope, but that helps, right? Is there a better, in principle or theoretical way in which we could do this thing? Okay, so let's go back to our names task here, right? So here we have this idea, and we've put this classification of names and then making a left or right response according to some rule. Here's the point. Here's what we'd like to do. Can we develop some method where we can very selectively get our interference stick and go and poke it into a very particular stage of processing without touching anything else as best we can, right? If we think that difficulty is task general, that if I slow this set of processes down anywhere, this cognitive control demand should just generally make memory better and eventually lead to some desirable thing. Or should we only think that slowing down the representation of the thing we're later going to be tested on, should that be a big deal? And that's the claim, and hopefully I can show you some data about that. Okay, we're going to use a few tasks like this, and they're really easy. They start off with this little cue, you get a word, and soon after, relatively quickly, about 100 milliseconds, you get a prime. We separate them just so that the prime has a little bit more punch, it distracts you a little bit more, right? But that's what we're going to do. We're going to show you a word to do a simple decision task on, or a categorization task, with distractors that sometimes say the right answer and sometimes say the opposite, right? And there's one that's distracting. It's really straightforward. I have this method slide, but I don't think we need it, right? we have 120 to 180 of these words. We show them once only. And then after you do this, we say, okay, surprise for psychologists. What were you expecting? Now there's a memory test for that stuff you saw. And we're going to test a bunch of the old items and a bunch of new items, and you just have to tell us, did you see this before in our test or not? All of the experiments are just like this. And we've got a bunch of them. And so what we want to go and do is look at interference at response, where we might use, response information or even a whole second task to generate response priming. Or we can use a whole bunch. So here we're looking at name gender, or typical name gender. We can look at typical animacy. We can look at size. So is there any evidence for the stuff I've spent way too long talking about so far? Can we prime you at response selection, or interfere is what we really mean? Can we interfere with this processing? Can we interfere with this? What do we predict? Okay, let's think about response stuff first, right? So if we're going to if we're going to help you with this response selection, help you with the finger you're supposed to be pressing, that we sort of consider that as some default state. We know that we need to selectively pay attention to and think about this response thing. This is a bunch of well-demonstrated stuff, right? So these ideas are not things we've dreamt up in the lab in the last 2 years, right? This is a bunch of foundational work over 50 years that we're pretty sure really actually lives in your head, that we can take advantage of as a tool. And so if we compare this compatible situation sort of as a baseline with what happens when we make interference here, I think our prediction should be that if really this is not a task-wide thing, we should predict that inducing this extra work, you have to pay attention, there's extra control, you have to fend off that wrong information, you have to make sure you don't make a mistake. We should slow down here, but this supervisory stuff, this supervisory cognitive control, should be cut short to some extent on your ability to just observe the meaning of the word as it goes by, right? And so I think our prediction here should be that priming at this response selection stage should actually predict worse encoding because we're drawing this cognitive focus away from the meaning of the word, right? And so, okay, what actually happens? Let's have a look. So I'm going to show you a bunch of graphs like this. They've got more bars than Danny, so I'll apologize extra. Not so much. Anyway. We have reaction time and we have accuracy for study. How did people do on the initial performance? Because what we'd really like to see is that incongruent things actually are harder, right? If we're talking about a desirable difficulty, we actually want it to be difficult for people, right? So yeah, we are slower when we make things not match, and you make more errors, right? So this is lower accuracy in some of our conditions. So yeah, it's difficult. That's a good precondition for what we want to then look at, right? And so here are the main data. Here's your accuracy for calling new things new. You're accurate 80% of the time. And this is your accuracy for calling old words old. And we can see here, and on the right-hand side here, we've basically split these bars up into how fast or slow people were at studying. So there's a bunch of detail we don't really want to get into here today, in that we're doing a bunch of these things, so we might look at the time course of things, we can compare divided attention costs to other desirable difficulty things. I'd be happy to talk to you about that after, but for today we can squint and look at the overall patterns of data here, where pretty strongly you are worse, right? You are worse when things are incongruent when they're difficult here, right? Difficulty is worse. This is not desirable. This is POD, plain old difficulty, right? This is pretty much as we predict, right? That we're drawing, this is saying that, at least in this case, we don't have this task-wide difficulty effect. It seems to be selective. We seem to be disadvantaging encoding for that item. The data we just looked at is actually from a slightly more complicated setup that looks like that, and we won't talk about that today. Semantic and category priming now. Okay, can we actually find some desirable difficulty, right? This doesn't work if we can't show actual desirable difficulty sometimes, right? All we can show is that I'm bad at doing experiments if we can't find these kind of things, which might still be true, but maybe not today. Okay, so can we prime this categorization stage? So let's consider our male-female task. We have our cognitive control set up as, yes, you have to pay attention to response selection. There's some amount of central attention paid to the meaning of the word as it goes by. what happens when we want to introduce this interference here, right? Introducing this incompatible flanker that slips into that sensation perception stream and gives you that semantic stuff without you trying to pay attention to it. Well, here we would like to predict the opposite, I think, right? Here we would like to predict that if this is where we're inducing this conflict in processing, if the thing we're making difficult is settling on what the actual category information is coming out of this stimulus Kate, if it's sending off, various strong associations that you've learned for the word Kate, Wuthering Heights, Emily Bronte, female, other things, right? Your friend Kate from down the street. This is where we really think this should be happening. And so here we would predict better encoding when we're interfering with more categorization level things, because to solve this problem, what you need to do is get more featural information, more semantic feature information out of the stimulus, right? In order to combat this thing, how do you get more information out of here? You grab that Kate concept, or category, or whatever we want to call it, and you squeeze it harder, right? You work on that thing, and that's how you generate it. And so in order to solve this processing problem, the byproduct is you have a lot more cognitive control paid to the representation, the semantic, meaningful representation of the stimulus. And as a byproduct, you get better encoding of it. So what actually happens? Okay, so when we start this, we look at, yes, incongruency is still worse, right? We slow you down and we make you more errorful, presumably because you're slower doing that semantic bit. But when we look at your memory performance, you have better memory in some circumstances, and it's a wash in all the others. We actually are seeing a desirable difficulty effect here when we're interfering with the semantic representation. Here's another replication with different materials and a different task. This is getting people to do animacy judgments, alive, not alive kind of things, or animal thing judgments. Again, we can show that you're worse in performance. It's mainly in reaction time here, but that's fine. And then you're better at memory, right? So this is what we would all like, hopefully, to agree on, that this is a desirable difficulty effect. I made the initial task hard, and you got a 5 or 6 or 7% memory boost for those hard items that you spend more time working on. When we make that same interference at the response thing within the same task, right? In the response ones, you're still saying, is this male or female? Is this big or small? We're just giving you different kinds of primes. It's still difficult, but it's doing a very, very, very different thing inside your head, right? And one of the ways we can tell, well, obviously your memory is better at the end, but we think this fits well, and importantly, it fits sensibly with a million other things we already know exist in psychology. Okay, so we're happy and excited about this kind of thing, right? So let me put the next one up. Here's the comparison between priming at response selection versus priming at categorization, right? Where is it that you're drawing this investment of cognitive control? When you happen to point that sort of mental encoding benefit at the content that you're later going to be tested on, you're better. If we had some clever way of testing which button you pressed, right? And it's hard here because you pressed one 80 times and the other one about 80 times, right? If we had a good way to test your memory for that, and we've been brainstorming like, okay, we need 160 unique responses somehow in this task and a memory for them. We'll work on that. Okay, so hopefully you're buying some of what I'm trying to sell here. So here's another, probably my favorite wrong direction result that we can turn into something more interesting. So here's another thing that should be one of these category things, big versus small. And so the particular task we give you here is, here's a giant list of items, 180 things. Tell me whether this is bigger or smaller than essentially a bread box, but no one knows what a bread box is. So is it bigger or smaller than the computer monitor that's in front of you, right? Because we can't find enough really big things and really small things to do an experiment, right? So we just get a whole bunch of things that aren't near enough to that. So we've got big and small, and we're saying relative to that computer monitor, is this thing big or small? Okay, so we show that absolutely. Giving you the wrong prime, giving the incompatible prime, makes you slower, makes you more errorful. Fantastic. And then we see this. And then we see that we don't have a desirable difficulty here. We see that we have plain old difficulty. You know, hundreds, thousands of years old, plain old difficulty. And the question is, why is this happening here? So when we first did this, it stopped us and made us think for a fair bit. But then we started to wonder whether this kind of task that we're doing here that the essence of the task was a little bit different than we'd been asking people to do for the male-female or the alive-not-alive. We're getting people to do a relational task here, right? We're asking people to make a judgment about the relative size of something that is not canonically big or small most of the time, right? We're giving you something that when that thing lights up in your head, big or small is not one of those features that pops up, right? If I say whale or skyscraper or mouse or pin, yeah, size is a meaningful semantic part of that thing, but that's not what we're doing here. We're saying, here's an object and here's another relative object, and now compare them and tell me what's going on. And so if that's true, maybe what we're seeing here is something like this, right? So when we have the priming case, that's fine. When we have the interference case, maybe you're doing something like this. Maybe you access the meaning of chair in order to know what you're looking at, but you don't get any automatic big or small information, right? You actually have to do another cognitive step. Maybe we're doing a task where we've actually generated this deliberate extra little chunk of processing that should be slow, should be effortful, it's much more evaluative, right? It's not this automatic categorization thing. So if that's true, we would very much like to think that we should be able to go and get canonically big and small things where it is a feature that pops in your head, like gender for names, like animacy for animals. And so we went and did that. And boy, is it hard to find 120 really big and really small things. So this has fewer conditions in it, but I think it shows the right thing. So this isn't a relative judgment. It's just, is this thing big or small? And so we see difficulty, not a lot of error, but a little bit. And here we see desirable difficulty at the end, right? Here we see better memory for things that are misprimed. So what we think is happening here is that we've gone back to this situation where you're not doing any real evaluative, careful, slow, volitional, figuring out, centrally limited work for the category. The category pops in your head, and you need to get more size information out of, chair is a bad example here, we should call this whale or something, right? You think about the concept more, the size information is available to you. You can't do that up here, and you do this evaluative thing. This distinction within essentially what most people would think of as essentially the same task, that's a little bit different. I think this is a useful and convincing thing, right? And it should also disturb us, right? If I said, go and do a big small task and put in some distractors, and surely that will help people learn. Well, this one really helps, and this one really hurts you, right? I know I certainly don't think anywhere close to this extent when I'm designing lecture materials. I hope none of you have to, right? But from a cognitive perspective, I think one of the things we ought to be worrying about is that there's a lot of stuff that goes on in your brain. And the labels of desirable difficulty are misleading to a sense, in that they trick us into thinking that we understand the mechanism. We do not understand those mechanisms, right? They're labels for things that have worked, which is fine for things that have been shown to work. But when we start using them as predictive tools, it gets messy, right? I think I've just walked through my next couple of slides, right? Task difficulty is not task general, right? Desirable difficulty isn't a mechanism. Difficulty is a thing that happens to a very particular kind of information processing in one of a big series of modules. And if we want to understand and make predictions about desirable difficulty, maybe it's not easy, right? Maybe this is a thing that is important. Attention and cognitive control is required for a lot of stuff. And focus on to-be-learned information, well, duh, right? Of course, that's an obvious thing. But it's not always really clear when we are focusing on the meaning of those words. I think before these experiments, I was certainly predicting that that big small thing would work because you're paying attention to the word. Apparently, you're not paying attention to the meaning of the word when you're doing that decision. You've dealt with it briefly, you put it aside, and then you're doing this relational big-small comparison thing. Doesn't feel like that, but it's apparently the best guess about what we're doing. So, we should be careful, is my vague take-home message about these things, right? There are many apparently desirable things that might actually hurt us, right? And I know Joe would like me to finish, but I have one more slide to show you because it's nice data. I would even go so far as to make enemies here, as to say there are maybe many other things aside from my esoteric information processing research, all favorites of ours in education cognition, that similarly might not work the way we assume them to work because of the labels we've given them, right? That all of the stuff we know about cognition is always in our heads, and it's pretty much always doing its thing even when we don't consider it in doing these things, right? So here's a great experiment, I think, because I did it, but Heather Poole and Jeff Norman here, everything I've shown you is very, very laboratory-based, and I'm one of the very least applied people in the room or who I know at all, right? As you've just observed from the last 40 minutes. This is an actual real in-the-classroom experiment, right? And the question is, does collaborative testing lead to better actual eventual class performance? So we did this study last year here at McMaster, semester-long, real classroom, third-year psychology course with about 120, 130 people in it. And so we essentially did a within subjects crossover design where we looked at collaborative testing versus individual testing in quizzes and tutorials, where people would either do those quizzes item by item and have them taken up by the professor, or did them individually. The materials are all the same, right? And we have midterm 1 and midterm 2. We have 2 separate pieces of non-cumulative information. So I think yesterday we talked about collaborative testing. I think we might talk about it a bit more this afternoon. We had collaborative quiz versus independently done quizzes on the exact same stuff. Then everyone did a midterm. Then we took up new material. We swapped over who was independent and who was collaborative. On new material, did a midterm on that stuff. What do we find? So this is performance on quiz grades, and like Danny's talked before, these are normalized Z scores where the mean is 0, so we can compare performance on different material and different exams. But we see a 0.2 to 0.3 benefit for people who did collaborative testing when we look at their performance on those collaborative quizzes, right? So absolutely, in the tutorials, it looks like people who are working collaboratively do much better, right? This would approach a whole letter grade difference in the data we're looking at, right? So then we look at how those people did on the actual midterm that they then went and did a few weeks later. Not well, right? The people who did the collaborative work did really well on those collaborative quizzes and felt good about it. And the people who did independent study felt bad and did worse, right? I don't know if they felt bad. I assume they felt bad when they saw this graph. But they certainly did worse, right? Then when you go and do the midterm, we get the exact opposite thing, right? People who did collaborative testing we see almost the same split in the exact opposite direction, right? Yeah?
Can I ask what you meant by collaborative testing?
There are 1,000,001 different things about collaborative testing. These were pairs of people sitting, working out problems together.
So they didn't do it individually at first, like Terry and Andrew were talking about?
No, you don't do it individually first. This is just looking at, did it on my own, or the pair would work together under instructions to explain the idea to each other and verbalize what they were doing, and to jointly, as much as we could make them work jointly, work out the problem together and come to an answer they both agreed on, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the typical collaborative testing effect, and this is not good, right? We would almost say that it's not just that there's no benefit to collaborative testing in this sense, but there's a substantial cost to have done that, right? Relative to everything we've just talked about, we could say that, and if we think about it a little bit, doing all of this independent work makes every person work particularly hard, even though they don't think they're doing very well, right? This is maybe a great example of a general desirable difficulty effect, right? This was really hard, it made everyone work hard. I suspect what we would find if we looked in here, though we haven't looked yet, is that half of these people, the better of each pair, does just fine. And the person with less knowledge was happily familiar and bumped along here, and they're the people who do terribly here because they didn't get as much individual work on things as we would see individually. I don't mean to say that collaborative testing is terrible and out the door now, but my general point is there are lots and lots of things that by their titles are good things. Collaborative testing and desirable difficulty are not mechanisms. They're not things that are guaranteed to work, right? They're labels we've put on stuff that happened to work better than that other random thing we did. Okay, so to summarize, I think the take-home should be fairly clear from this point, right? Difficulty is process-specific. Making a task difficult is this weird non sequitur that we should be uncomfortable with, right? Other things we know about cognitive psychology are at work, whether we believe it or not, whether we pay attention, whether we remember or not, right? And we should be careful about the things that we go and apply, right? Because we do not understand a lot of this stuff. And so, yes, as a cognitive psychologist, I'll make a last plug to say that understanding the mechanisms of those things might in fact be an important thing for us. Thank you very much.